There exists in TFT a concept that I like to refer to as the hierarchy of resources. This hierarchy is not necessarily built upon the particular importance of any given type of resource, or the usefulness, or numerous other metrics which might come to mind immediately when looking at it. It is, rather, built upon how malleable each resource is. In this context, the malleability of a resource refers to how easy it is to change the shape, or more aptly put, the flexibility of each of the resources and how they direct your game. At the bottom of the hierarchy lies gold and units. It's no secret that in any given meta, there will generally be one, if not two or more, compositions that only function if they have an incredible amount of gold at their disposal. Think AMP or Vertical Boombot in the context of set 14. However, in general, gold is a resource that isn't indexed on to a large degree when approaching line selection in a game of TFT. Having a lot of gold certainly opens up lines that might not have been possible otherwise, but isn't necessarily indicative enough on its own to force said lines. Similarly, the units that show up in your shop, particularly the ones that show up naturally, can give you a bit more direction in a game, but are not the end-all be-all. For example, let's say you have 3 Dr. Mundos, a key unit for one of the premier reroll lines in set 14 by the time 2-1 rolls around. These Dr. Mundos alone are not enough for you to fully commit to rerolling the line, or at least shouldn't be, but can be an indication that the line is a possibility in this game. Maybe a few more belts, or the right augment, and all of a sudden, it's a Dr. Mundo game. Without those extra resources lining up, however, you will be all too happy to relegate him to the role of some nice frontline for a smoother stage 2. Similarly, if you just so happen to hit 3 brands on stage 4, a 4-cost ability power carry, but you have only attack damage items, you're not going to suddenly change your whole game plan to play around him. You'll just sell them, get some gold back, and go along your merry way. At the top of the hierarchy is augments, definitively the least malleable of any resource in a game of TFT. Once you select an augment, there's absolutely no changing what it does and how it affects your game. You can't sell it like a unit, get more interest to recuperate it like gold, or make one of many different completed items like with item components. A hero augment will hard commit you to playing a particular reroll comp in a given game, and even the quote-unquote generic augments, imagine something like Item Collector or Clockwork Accelerator, all want to be played around in a relatively specific way that is now irreversible. While I won't talk about augments extensively in this video, I will add here that this lack of malleability makes augments the single most important resource to play around, as in you should be trying to match other resources to your augments as much as possible. Just like how you wouldn't abandon playing a game of the Jolly Drunkard after taking Chugbug just because you hit an early Aphelios, you should be making an excess of damage items and buying only carry units after taking something like Ascension. In the middle of the hierarchy, we have items, which are in my opinion the most complicated and consequently most interesting resources in TFT. Items are permanent for the most part, reforgers exist on top of a couple of augments that can change your items for you, but most components you get are what you get. While this is the case, it is also true that items are more malleable than augments for one reason in particular, in that they get dropped as components and not as completed items. Pretty much every component can fill a variety of roles when turning into a fully completed item. A bow can be a Kraken's Fury or a Rage Blade to play into a ramping fight. It can be a Last Whisper or a red buff for utility. It can be a Nashers to speed up an ability power's carry's damage, or a Giant Slayer to speed up any carry's ability to do damage. Not every component is as good as every other component at filling each role, but with good item economy, you can turn one of the least malleable resources in TFT into a consistent source of stability. What is item economy exactly? At its simplest, it's the idea that you should always be building up with your items, and that you should be looking for multiplicative value from your items. Starting with the first concept, components you don't want should become items that are okay, components that are okay should become items that are good, and components that are amazing for you should become BIS, or best in slot items. It isn't always as night and day as this, of course, as nothing in TFT really is. Sometimes turning a bad component into a decent item can mean combining it with a really good component, and the viability of such a decision is often incredibly dependent on the context of your other items. One of the most important things you can do when learning, or even creating, a new comp is getting familiar with which item components are highly valuable for the comp and which are not so great, and coming up with ways in which you can kill the bad components. Often, the most contested components on carousels in any given patch are those which are heavily utilized by the strongest comps, which can assist in forming an understanding of what those comps should be prioritizing. Furthermore, with a strong understanding of this aspect of item economy in the meta, you can try to play anti-meta lines, which seek to play around less desired components. This increases the consistency of getting these components on any given carousel round. Understanding how to get multiplicative value out of your items is an integral part of capping out boards and is a huge consideration when approaching item economy in any game of TFT. Let's discuss multiplicative value as it relates to damage items first. There are 3 basic categories which enhance how much damage a unit does. These are damage amplification, found on items such as Giant Slayer and Striker's Flail, Crit, found on items such as Jeweled Gauntlet and Infinity Edge, and Raw Stats, found on items such as Deathblade and Rabadon's Deathcap. There's another category, or category and a half kind of, that is made up by mana generation and attack speed that we'll get to in a second. These first three basic ways to increase a unit's damage can be found in augments, and synergies, and most importantly, in items. To maximize a unit's damage, you ideally would be pulling a bit from each category, as damage across categories is multiplicative, while damage within a category is additive. For example, if you had a synergyless unit with 3 Deathblades, we'll ignore the little bit of damage amp it gives for the sake of the hypothetical, it would do significantly less damage than the same unit with Deathblade, Infinity Edge, and Striker's Flail. The extra AD from the second and third Deathblade would not interact with the AD from the first Deathblade. That is to say, that extra AD doesn't make the AD already there any better. If you have a Deathblade, then add an Infinity Edge, all of a sudden, all of that bonus AD from the first Deathblade will now critically strike. And if you top it off with a Striker's Flail, then that large amount of critically striking AD is now also being amplified. Essentially, 3 times 3 times 3 is a bigger number than 3 plus 3 plus 3. Attack speed and mana generation are an additional multiplier, but can sometimes be a bit finicky depending on how the unit actually works. Something that generates mana like Spear of Shojin is not super effective on a unit that doesn't care about its cast as much as its auto attacks, but attack speed can act as effective mana generation for a unit that wants to cast but doesn't care about its auto attacks. I think you can generally group attack speed items and mana generation into the same category for cast-oriented units, but you want to stick to attack speed items only in that category for auto attack reliant units. Defensive items are very similar in that there are a number of categories to pull from, and you'll want to look for multiplicative value where you can. These categories are health, resistances, that being armor and magic resistance, damage reduction, healing, and mana generation. Generally speaking, the quality of your frontline items will matter less than the quality of your backline items, which is why you'll often see things land a bit willy-nilly in the frontline. Finding ways to sneak in more multiplicative value through good item economy can be a huge difference maker in games. Beyond just looking for every damage type or frontline type, this can take form in things like streaking early by finding 3 items for a unit, rather than an item or 2 for 2 different units, as the value of each item on a unit goes up a lot the more items, and specifically multiplicative items, are on a unit. It is also important to recognize the efficacy of each individual item on a unit, and understand that a situation might not be 3 times 3 times 3 versus 3 plus 3 plus 3, but 3 times 3 times 3 versus 3 plus 9 times 3, with little parentheses around the 3 and 9. This comes up with radiant items and artifacts mostly, where getting additive value from an extremely strong item can be more impactful than multiplicative value from a normal item. This is probably a good time to add, no pun intended, that if you enjoy this style of content and you want to see more of it, you can subscribe to the channel for totally free, and it supports me and makes me more likely to make more stuff like this, so I would super appreciate it. And if you're interested in any kind of TFT coaching, my Metafy is linked down below, and there's a lot of availability if you want it, and if it looks like it's a good idea for you and you're hitting a wall on TFT, it might not be a bad idea. So anyways, back to the video. Now that we've discussed the fundamentals of item economy, let's apply them to one of the strongest comps in set 14, Exotech Zeri, and see what makes the comp strong and what should be prioritized. There are 2 items that see a ton of play and good success on the board, those specifically being Kraken's Fury and Guinsoo's Rageblade. Furthermore, nearly every board in the game wants some kind of anti-heal and some kind of armor shred / magic resistance reduction depending on the damage type of the carry, in this case physical damage. There are 2 ways to get armor sunder with items, Last Whisper and Even Shroud. Last Whisper sounds like a tempting item, but the issue with it is that it kills a bow, an S+ tier component here, and a crit glove, a pretty good component, to make a pretty good item. Even Shroud, on the other hand, uses 2 just alright components to make a pretty good item, so ideally, we turn belts and cloaks into an Even Shroud. Similarly, it would be very difficult to justify slamming a red buff that kills 2 bows, so for anti-heal, ideally we'd either get a Morello's or a Sunfire Vest, with Morello's being the best because it can kill any extra rods we get beyond the one in our Guinsoo's Rageblade. The priority on getting 2 bows, as well as the usefulness of bow for other completed items, should also indicate that ideally we only play on Exotech Zeri if we have either a bow opener, an item augment that makes it easier to hit everything, or a loose streak opener for carousel priority. As for other components, we can turn swords into Infinity Edges, Death Blades, or Giant Slayers if we have some extra bows for Zeri and Jhin very easily, and chains and tiers can become strong frontline items like Protector's Vow for Sejuani, or other tank items for Mordekaiser. Put like this, it's fairly straightforward to see how easy Exotech is from an item economy standpoint, as every component has multiple strong use cases, and multiples of practically any component are workable. Beyond combining multiple damage and frontline types lies a more abstract and fundamental avenue to producing multiplicative value. There are a number of genres among completed items. Guinsoo's Rageblade and Kraken Slayer are items which get stronger the longer the fight goes on, so they fall under the ramp genre. Items like Giant Slayer, Striker's Flail, Deathblade, Rabadon's Infinity Edge, and Jeweled Gauntlet fall under the mid-range genre. They add damage up front that doesn't scale over the course of the fight. Titan's Resolve, Sterix, Hand of Justice, and Bloodthirster fall under the Bruiser category, and are effective on units that want to take damage while dealing damage, or, more specifically, take damage to deal more damage. Then you have items like Warmogs, Bramble Vest, Dragon's Claw, and these are frontline items, and their primary purpose is to just keep a frontline tank alive. Taking into account Radiant and Artifact items, there are even more genres, something like Manazane and Prowler's Claw promoting extremely fast fights. All of this is to say that every item in the game excels at filling a particular role, and promotes building your board in a certain way as a result. Earlier, I mentioned the idea of fully itemizing a single unit as a strong way of creating powerful early boards due to the multiplicative nature of items interacting when put together. But in truth, you can find ways to do this even without putting the items on the same unit. If you have an Archangel's Staff or a Gwynsu's Rageblade, for example, and a belt on your bench going into the next carousel round, taking another belt to make a Warmogs and extend the fight, which allows your ramp item to ramp, may just be a more effective take than taking a Crit Glove to make a Striker's Flail on the unit holding the ramp item. Interactions like this are what I like to call conceptual multiplicative value, where the value being multiplied is in the wants of one resource getting supported by another resource. If you have a ramp item that wants an extended fight, and a frontline item that extends the fight, boom, multiplicative value. If you have 6 strong backliners sharing a synergy, like 6 rapid fire, and mid-range items that take advantage of all your damage to end a fight quickly, boom, multiplicative value. Conversely, if you have a ton of frontline items or units, and no ramp in your backline itemization-wise or otherwise, you'll probably struggle unless your board is much more expensive than an opponent's. We can even see this idea of conceptual multiplicative value in meta comps like Exotech Zeri, where the trade is giving a large amount of tankiness to the team, so ramp items are mandatory to make the board succeed. We can also see it in a common archetype, Fast 9 Legendary Soup, that has been in TFT for as long as I can remember. When going Fast 9 and playing around legendaries, the best players prioritize gold over item quality on early carousels, and generally just look to make items that make as much sense together as possible without playing into any particular genre. You'll see Giant Slayer slams, Morello slams, Red Buff slams, Striker's Flail slams, pretty much anything mid-range and not very committal. This is because the more expensive your board is, the less you need to have any particular genre of fight for your board. This is where mid-range, non-committal items exceed. This same principle is why you can see boards with multiple legendaries lose fights to more focused level 8 boards, or even reroll boards with a clear genre of fight in mind, just like how an expensive board needs less focus, and an inexpensive board relies on it. In set 14, we see this in the form of many relatively cheap 6 Vanguard boards that rely on big frontline and backline item quality, as well as things like Divinicore Z that focuses heavily on quickly killing key backline threats and wants less frontline items as a result. Next time you play a comp, ask yourself what genre of fight you're trying to play into, and let that help you figure out what exactly you should be looking for item-wise. When to slam a completed item is a question that is incredibly hard to answer because there really is no specific universal answer. There is one thing I've found, however, that makes answering the question significantly easier, and that is, if it's going to make you meaningfully stronger, slam it. Now, that is of course an incredibly loaded statement that doesn't necessarily account for the intricacies of the game, specifically the context crucial to actually understanding whether an item should truly be slammed or not, but let me explain it a bit and tell you why it's so helpful. The tempo of your game and the items you slam are inextricably linked, with the number of items you have and their quality being one of, if not the most determining factor in a board's early and mid-game strength. The cool thing is, you can manipulate the quality of your items to always be good, in large part due to the hierarchy of resources. We established just a minute ago that the more gold you have on your board, the less focused it needs to be, particularly in the context of late-game Fast 9 type stuff. This concept, however, doesn't just apply to late game, it applies to every part of the game. If you have a ton of 2-starred units on stage 2, often you don't even need to slam an item immediately to win your early fights. However, if you only have 1-starred units, making sure your items are focused on a certain genre of fight is critical to being strong. You need to make sure your resources, items included, are lining up in a way where you can create an identity for your fight sooner rather than later. For example, if you have Tyr and Rod on stage 2, along with some 2-starred AP units, don't say me Zeri and coin flip your whole game on loose streaking into a level 8 roll down, instead of making the AP items and winning fights. Going back to the comment of, if it's going to make you meaningfully stronger, slam it. We can see that meaningfully is doing a lot of heavy lifting. If you're high rolling unit quality on stage 2, then slamming an item may not make a difference in a fight, rendering it meaningless. Similarly, if you lose whether you slam an item or not, it's meaningless. Conversely, if slamming an item makes a difference in your fight, or most of your upcoming fights, then understand what it's going to need to be supported by later to stay strong and what kind of comp it can play into, meta or not. One of the most detrimental things to a game can often be slamming generic items like red buff Morellos from behind when you don't actually have the gold to play a mid-range fight with high unit quality. Your stage 2 and 3 will feature you a bit behind the power curve of the lobby, and you won't ever be able to really make an identity for your fight. In actuality, there's no such thing as a non-committal item slam, so understanding the implications of any particular slam will give you the confidence to slam completed items more proactively. Perhaps the most rewarding part of coming to understand everything that we've discussed is the ability to create comps for yourself on the fly and really embrace the fluidity of play that TFT has to offer. By understanding when to slam an item, what that item wants you to play around, who wants to carry that item, and what augments make that item better, you can create clearly defined boards that win in somewhat unique ways. If you have a ton of mid-range items and are offered this augment, maybe you play the fastest fight you've ever seen with little front line and a ton of back line that wins immediately. If you have a ton of front line but can't seem to get the bow for Rageblade, maybe you make an Archangels and play around the 2-star branch you hit while looking for better options. The possibilities aren't endless, not really, but they sure as hell feel like it when you let the pieces fall into place. And when I tell you that you'll have some of the most satisfying 4th places from some of the most doomed spots of all time, I really do mean it.